Is the August 29th meeting of the Policy Committee, and we are resuming our review of all district policies in 2022. We have a few policies left over from last spring that Dr. Lutz is going to review with us in the 100s and 200s. And then we're going to shift to the 600s. And Ms. Green, our business administrator, will be joining us for that portion of the agenda. All right, so I'm going to begin by sharing my screen. Oh, Mr. Coughlin, if you wouldn't mind allowing me to share my screen, that'd be great. And I'll be able to
okay, you're good to go, Doc.
Policy in question. Excellent. Thank you. So we're going to begin with policy 146. And this is a new policy that PDE requested that districts have on trauma-informed practices. And Dr. Lutz, I'll leave it to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Yannicone. So 146.1 is the trauma-informed approach. It follows along with Act 55 from the PA School Code, which requires school districts to provide training to all staff members under a trauma-informed lens. So this policy highlights some of the actions that the district is going to take to address our learning environment, student behavior, and our programming to ensure equitable access for all students. There will be training for staff members, and we will report on key data points as we complete our K through 12 student services plan, which is dictated by PDE. Any questions on 146.1?
So you can see there, we had the option of checking boxes in different areas with regard to authority, delegation of responsibility, and just the kinds of work we'll be doing. So you can see that with regard to delegation of responsibility, Dr. Lutz will have primary responsibility, and then it allows the board and me to be directed. If there's anything that the board would like, you can certainly direct us as such. You can also direct the supervisor of campus safety. And then you can see where we've put our training emphasis under the guidelines. And then our education focus and staff wellness focus. And with regard to data collection, we're looking at doing this as part of our K-12 student services plan. So essentially, we're going to be doing just about everything that they are expecting us to be doing. Yeah. Please let us know if you have any questions. Otherwise, we'll move this one forward for approval on the 6th.
Can I ask just one quick question? Well, I understand that the plan itself, or the plan for the approach, I guess, is not yet done, right? That's what will be developed and implemented?
So we do actually have a trauma-informed plan, because separate of this policy, like I said, Act 55 requires us to do some training every year with our staff members. So we already have a plan of making sure that we hit that target. We have an outside contractor that's going to be coming in. Prior to the pandemic, we had already done what is trauma-informed with the staff members. We feel like we've done a good job explaining, looking at students through trauma-informed lenses. That's part of our equitable practices work as well. So this is going to be a more applicable to your classroom. What are some real strategies that you can do to make your classroom more trauma-informed? So that's going to be part of our plan for professional development a little bit later this year. And then in addition to that, we know that across all of our buildings, we're doing universal design for learning as a strategy for how to address all students. So that really looks at inclusion practices and making the curriculum accessible to all students. And then trauma-informed folds really nicely into that as well, so that it's not like this standalone kind of separate entity. We just put it in as part of our best teaching practices that all teachers should be doing.
Can we just know, I guess, when that stuff happens?
Mhm.
Makes sense.
Yep.
On board. Thank you.
Yep.
I think it will probably be worthwhile, and Dr. Lutz, we can take this back to the Office of Teaching and Learning for us to provide an overview at some point for the board
Mhm.
on our professional learning plan for the year, all the training
Yep.
that staff receive. There's quite a bit of training actually that's happening this week, obviously as
Mhm.
part of in-service, but then there's ongoing training both at the building levels as well as at the district level. So we have the half-day professional learning afternoons beginning in October, that we have several of those throughout the year. We have our 2 major days in November and February, full days, and then we have a full day at the end of January as well.
Yep.
And then we have building-based training that occurs throughout the year in staff meetings, as well as the in-service schedule. So we can certainly put together an overview for the board so you know when these types of trainings are occurring.
Mhm.
All right, so we're going to shift into the 200s and start with class rank. Dr. Lutz, we'll go back to you.
Sure. So we updated this policy to reflect the student grade point averages that are obtained from final course grades are now used to determine class rank for each grade at the high school. And that's the highlighted, those grades that are in there.
So that's very minor, just adding the grade, the word grade. And then we're going to come back to 216.1.
So
217.
217, not much is changing in 217, which is the graduation policy. You'll see that most of the language remains the same. However, there is a change recommended for provisions for awarding a diploma to eligible veterans of World War II, the Korean War, or the Vietnam War. So those veterans who may have left high school prior to obtaining their diploma in order to enlist can now receive those awards. And that's listed out in there. So the superintendent would submit any names of community members to the board for approval so that they could receive their high school diploma. And then once this policy is approved, all of this information would go over to the high school so that they can make sure that they have everything aligned with this policy.
I have a quick clarification question, which is, I'm just curious why it ends, it doesn't have more recent deployments, why it ends at,
I believe because now the government is more stringent about you have to be 18 and you're supposed to have your high school diploma prior to enlisting, whereas
Gotcha.
that was maybe not the case, especially during World War II.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
I think this will be a nice opportunity for some community outreach once the policy is approved. There may be impending graduates that we're unaware of, and we can reach out to the community and see if there's anyone who comes forward with a family member for whom this was the case.
Yeah. This might be something for the township newsletter.
Yes, absolutely. So this one will move forward and we'll shift to 224, care of school property.
Okay, another tiny policy, but this is just providing individual schools with the responsibility to ensure that our students take care of the property, any materials that are loaned out to them, school books, Chromebooks, things like that. And that parents and guardians can be held liable for any damages that occur. And also listed in here is that any acts of vandalism would be directly reported to the board so that you would be aware of that. Just as a side note to this policy, we actually worked a little bit this summer to talk about how we support our families when they do owe an obligation. So students lose a textbook. We rethought that process so that we were making sure that we were communicating to parents, but also making sure that parents knew that if they weren't able to afford some of those obligations, they knew where to go to request some supports, and that gets on the radar of our social workers so that they can be thinking about them at other times of the year as well to provide support. And then we talked about the vandalism through our disciplinary policy to make sure that we had a clear and consistent vision of what vandalism really meant to us. So damage over $500, which is consistent with the law, so that we knew when we were reporting out about that.
Are there any questions? All right, so then we'll switch to the last of the 200s left to do, threat assessment.
Yep. So threat assessment is another policy that is required under Act 55. As a school district, we have to have trained threat assessment teams so that anytime that there is a physical threat posed by a student or a staff member towards one of our buildings, we're able to go through an actual research-based checkbox list where we determine what type of threat is this, and then what are the actions that our team needs to take in order to appropriately support the student and get them hooked up with services so that hopefully they don't carry out the threat. That's the entire goal of threat assessment. I do want to note that if we conduct a threat assessment and we refer a student to outside resources, counseling or some type of, community-based therapy sessions, that doesn't necessarily state that we can't also apply our disciplinary processes with that student. But this is something to make sure that that student is also getting support. And so we do already have our teams trained, but we have some new staff members. We have the training scheduled for October 12th that every team in the district, so all 4 buildings have a team, will get trained on this, but it's also the ACT date. So we're gonna look to reschedule that to sometime in October, or else our high school counselors would be pulled a little too thin that day. But please know that all our counselors, our psychologists, our social workers, and a designated administrator at each building will be trained in threat assessments, and they'll form the threat assessment team to make sure that we're implementing this anytime that a student poses a threat.
So Dr. Lutz, can you confirm for me what would you like under delegation of responsibility?
Yep. So under delegation, individuals to a threat assessment team at each school building in the district should be checked. And then the next one should be members of the student assistance program team, behavioral health professionals, members of the Safe to Say Something crisis team, and then that box that says the superintendent or designee may assign additional staff can be checked. Then under training, it's superintendent or designee, school safety and security coordinator. And then 5 through 9 are also checked. And then if you go down under inquiry and assessment, all 5 of those that are highlighted should be checked. And then finally, down on the last page under annual board report, it should be checked under the annual threat assessment report shall be presented as part of the annual report to the board.
So for board members, you may recall that that occurs in June. The presentation that we gave in June that Dr. Lutz gave is part of that. Are there any questions? This again is a new policy. Are there any questions about the content of this policy or the selections made? Okay, so these will move forward. All these 100 and 200 level policies will move forward for a first reading on the 6th, and they'll be then moved into the permanent board docs at the end of the month after our second board meeting in September. Okay. And I want to thank Dr. Lutz. I know she's done a lot of work this summer with the policies. She's done a terrific job in getting us through, in particular, the 200s, which are really dense in content because they are about student life. Also, at this point, just want to mention to the board that the administrative regulations that go along with these policies, Dr. Lutz and I have met every week this summer with the administrative team, different members of the administrative team as needed and as appropriate to revise all of the administrative regulations. We had spoken about the fact that we put that into an internal document. Anything that needs to be published publicly is attached to the 200 level policies already. But we also have made sure that every administrative regulation now comes into compliance with any new policy revisions. So that all that work was also completed this summer. And Dr. Lutz,
well, that's really great.
I'm sorry, Sarah, could you repeat that?
Oh, I just said thank you both for this incredible work.
Thank you. Yeah, we feel really good about this piece. And with these few policies, we have now wrapped up all of the student-focused policies of the district. And so we're going to be shifting. We had completed the 300s in the spring. So we're going to be shifting to finances, which is why Ms. Green is here. And I'm going to let Dr. Lutz go. I know she has a lot of work this week, training and meeting with new staff. So I'm going to let her go, and we'll shift to Ms. Green for the finance section.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lutz.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So similar, and I'm not sure how much time the board has had to take a look at the 600 level policies, but all of these policies, there's a cross-reference at the bottom of the document, which is helpful as the cross-references have been in each section, if you want to look at a summary. But I'm going to let Ms. Green decide where would you like to begin policy-wise, and I'll clip to that policy.
Sure. Thank you, Dr. Yannicone. Good morning, everyone. I'm new to this process. I know you guys have been doing this with the 100s, 200, 300. So just as a matter of, I guess, clarification, there are a number of policies in the 600 levels that will be accepted without any change. So I don't believe that we need to go through that, but do those need to be listed or discussed, or we're good with how they were listed on the agenda?
Yeah, we do have them on the agenda. There's a whole list of the policies where PSBA did not recommend any changes. So the thought was that we would simply update the reviewed by date so that we could see that we did in fact have PSBA review them in 2022 and that no changes were recommended. And that list of policies is on the agenda. Let me stop share for just a minute. I'll go back to the agenda. And then I'll resume share. So this list of policies is agenda item 2 for this morning. These would all be listed for, they still need 2 readings, even though there are no changes, because we are updating the date by which we reviewed the policies. So all of these don't have a single word of difference based on PSBA's recommendations. So what we're recommending is you just move them forward for a first reading. Are there any questions? Okay. All right, so what'll happen is they'll all get added to Tuesday night's agenda for first reading. And then we'll go to item 3 on our agenda today. We have 4 policies that have minor language changes. And Carol, I'll just go right in and start with 03.
Sure, perfect.
Okay.
So there was a very minor change recommended by PSBA on policy 603, which is budget preparation. And basically it clarified, you'll see the bolded proposed. All that's doing is just aligning it to Act 1 index timeline, which is the state timeline verbiage. And the reason proposed and preliminary is, if you remember last year, we did not do a preliminary budget. We went through the opt-out resolution. So it was a proposed budget that was presented to the board, not a preliminary budget. So this is just tweaking that language slightly in the event that we move forward with the alternate of not going through a preliminary budget. Very slight change. Any questions? Okay, so then we'll bring that one forward with those changes. Next one is 604. Which is budget adoption. Again, PSBA put forward some recommendations to align the verbiage with Act 1 timeline. And basically it includes accelerated budget process option and board resolution. The accelerated budget process option is one that historically the district has gone through, and that's presenting a preliminary budget. And then the board resolution is what we did last year when the board approved the resolution that allowed us to move forward with a budget, knowing that we would not go above index. So it's just clarifying the different types of, I guess, first look at budget on the budget process. So there's very slight changes with that. So we will bring that forward with those slight changes. Any questions on this? Okay. We'll go to 614, which is payroll authorization. This was slightly tweaked. You'll see immediate supervisor is bolded. What they did here was there was a revision in policy 330 that talked about overtime, and basically overtime is not to be granted without prior approval from your immediate supervisor. So they just align this payroll authorization guideline language to reflect policy 330. With adding the immediate supervisor. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay, we'll bring that forward with that slight change. And the next one is 625. And this one is procurement cards. And basically this discusses the procedure and definition of a procurement card, which is the same as a credit card. So the district does have a procurement card. This basically outlines some processes, delegation responsibility. It aligns some clarification on the use of procurement cards. Currently, right now, the district credit card is housed in my office. It has to be signed out to be used, has to have pre-approval for use. Once the purchase is done, on the actual login sheet, it tells what vendor we're using. So all of that is reviewed and signed off prior to the person using the procurement card. Once the procurement card is used, they have to bring back a receipt, re-sign the procurement card in. So the procurement card is never outside of the business office longer than the use of the actual card. It is my responsibility, along with Samantha Jenko, who is the Assistant Business Administrator, to review those statements monthly to ensure that use was actually done. So there are checks and balances within my office to ensure that there's no fraudulent use. So this just clarifies the procedure, which is already in place within my office. Are there any questions on this policy? Okay, then we'll move this policy forward with the changes as recommended. Dr. Yannicone, we're going to go back to 610, which is, I believe this will be agenda item number 4, talking about a little bit more substantive changes other than just the recommendations. you will see on policy 610, this is purchase subject to bid and quotation. So this policy was updated to each year, the Department of Labor publishes what the annual threshold is that allows districts to purchase with just phone quotes or 3 quotes, as opposed to going out for public bid on goods and services. Each year that threshold changes. PSBA initially identified putting that threshold number in. After review and discussion, the recommendation bringing forward is to add language so that we don't have to come back to this policy every year to change that number, because we would have to change that number in order to keep up with the state, is to put the verbiage that we will abide by the state's annual published threshold limit, so that we don't have to revisit this policy each year. And then we can follow that. So you'll see that it was 21.9 was the threshold limit that was published for this year. Next year, it'll go up higher. So we would have to come back and change that number and tweak it. So instead of doing that, we're just putting the annual threshold language in there. So that was the big change in this policy. Are there
Are
any
you all
questions?
comfortable with that? And I'm noticing under price quotations, Ms. Green, should we do the same under number 1? Change the language similarly?
Yeah, we'll change. Yes, the change will need to be with the 21.9, not the 11.8. That 11.8 stays consistent. That doesn't change.
Okay,
So I can update that so that it has the annual, that it's consistent down in that guideline.
so do you want the same language, annual bidding threshold limits?
Yes,
Okay. I'll make that shift. Same thing on number 2.
yes. And then it looks like,
Is that enough, or do you want the entire phrase
no, that's fine.
as annually determined?
Yes, that's perfect. Especially since it's clarified above.
Okay. Same thing on number 2.
Yes,
Okay,
could read exactly the same.
you got it. Okay. Is everybody comfortable with the way that looks?
Okay, the next policy will be 611. And again, similar verbiage was put into this policy. So this policy determines what needs to be brought in front of the board. We had discussed this, I believe, last year in Finance Committee, that the original policy identified a threshold limit, and that threshold limit did reflect the same annual bidding threshold limit. So basically, any purchase or contract, we'll say contract that doesn't hit the threshold limit, it delegates responsibility that Dr. Yannicone or myself are able to approve that purchase to move forward, and it doesn't have to be brought in front of the board. This allows for timeliness of being able to get through contracts and not having to wait for the board to review those. We can lower that amount at your comfort level. Again, this was discussed in Finance Committee last year. So we've been following this practice on being consistent on making sure that we follow this policy on what we bring in front of the board. Again, it was always benchmarked against the Department of Labor's threshold limit on purchases. That number can be adjusted. That was just the baseline that we were using. So this was our recommendation. Again, the same recommendation made to put the annual bidding limit instead of putting a number. That way we don't have to come back and retweak this policy each year. But if that number or threshold limit is too high or doesn't meet your approval, we can always adjust it to a number that you're comfortable with. Any comments or questions? Everybody comfortable with putting the annual threshold limit number? Okay.
That's very helpful to us. So
Yeah,
thanks
thank
for continuing to support that. From a timeliness standpoint, that's really helpful to us.
Okay, the next one is 616, Dr. Yannicone.
Okay.
Okay. And with 616, if you go down, there you go.
Yeah.
So basically what this addresses is in the original, kind of the guidelines or the notes on this policy. It talks about signatures and it talked about having the signature of the board president, the board secretary, treasurer, and then the vice president could be the signature in place of the president. From as long as I could tell, only 2 signatures have been required on our checks. That is the practice that we have right now. And currently those signatures are myself and Samantha Jenko, who I am the board secretary in the role of board secretary and board treasurer. Those signatures are printed as the checks are printed within our software system. There are controls in place that we have as far as printing and making sure that there's a review of those. There's also controls in place of uploading those signatures, so they just can't be changed at a whim. Currently on our bank accounts, the president, vice president, myself, and Samantha are authorized signatures. So in the absence of either myself or Sam holding those positions, then the board president and then the board vice president would be the second signature, and we would change that moving forward. So this just clarifies that procedure and clarifies that information. It also talked about, which I think is a little antiquated, having plate stamps when signatures are happening. I think that was in the pre-days of having signatures loaded on financial systems where you actually had to, run the checks through a stamper so that it actually stamped. Actually, at my old district, we actually had that. So we had the plate stamps every year. So that's just clarifying and cleaning up that language, talking about the signatures, the required number of signatures, how those signatures are housed. Are there any questions or any clarification needed on this policy change? I feel like I'm the boring policies, but that's okay.
No, it's not at all. It's good room for jokes about the Pony Express or something like that.
Okay, so that will be brought forward with those changes. The next one is policy 620, Dr. Yannicone. And this talks about fund balance. And basically the change here is if you look where it talks about guidelines and it talks about unassigned fund balance. It talked about the board getting involved when a minimum threshold of 2% of unassigned fund balance was hit. Reviewing that and reviewing finance committee meetings and discussion about fund balance with the board, I wanted to recommend bringing that higher. I thought 2% was a low benchmark to allow our unassigned fund balance to drop before the board would take action to make sure that we were above that threshold. So my recommendation coming forward is to increase that to 4%. Now, again, this is unassigned fund balance. This is not the whole fund balance. You know that fund balance is in different pockets. So the 25 million that we have in fund balance is assigned in different pockets. 8% is the state's limit based upon our budgeted expenditures that we can have in unassigned. So this would be a range of saying that we need to keep our unassigned fund balance between 4% and 8%. And if it fell below 4%, then the board would take action to make sure that we maintain that 4%. So the change is going from 2 to 4%, which is putting us at a little bit higher expectation of where we keep our unassigned fund balance. Are there any questions?
I think this is an important consideration for the board. We have worked hard, as Ms. Green said, not to have to use fund balance. As you know, from year to year, we really try to be conservative enough with funding that we don't actually dip into it. But this is us setting a more conservative plan than we have had in the past. We hope not to have to use it at all, but it is an important conversation and discussion for the board.
No, to be sure, and if I can piggyback on Dr. Yannickon's comments, Ms. Green, I'm totally on board with the concept. I'm just curious why 4% as opposed to 3 or 5 or 6 or something like that. Could you talk about that?
I was just looking at beefing it up. I think based upon how strong our fund balance are and the importance that we placed on fund balance, and making sure that we have a healthy fund balance, I think a range of 4% of keeping it between 4 and 8%, that gives us a 4% wiggle room. I just think that tightens that gap a little bit and holds us to a little bit higher standard, to make sure that we're as fiscally healthy and sound as possible. So that's why I went with the 4%.
Okay, makes sense. And just 4%, I guess, give you more flexibility than 5%.
Yes, it would. I think going a 3% gap, I think, is a little bit too tight. I think 4% puts us right in that sweet spot. And again, this is no benchmarking against any other district. Fund balance with districts are unique to each district. There's no real industry standard other than the 8% cap on unassigned, because fund balance use for each district is different at all levels. And there's a different philosophy as far as the board and administration that has with fund balance. So I was looking at it more from not putting it in a nice threshold where board would have to take action. I thought having unassigned down to 2% and then that triggering the board to do something in this policy was a little bit too low. That's why I bounced it up to 4%. I think going higher than that, that's bringing the board in when we're still healthy and strong, and it's not that lower point. So it was more looking at it from the 2% rather than going up as closer to 8%, if that makes sense.
Makes sense. Thank you for the explanation.
Sure. Any other
Mr. Coughlin, I want to just interrupt for a moment. I noticed that Ms. Hughes unfortunately dropped off. I know she was on the train. So just keep an eye out. She may be trying to get back in to the room. And then Ms. Green, I had one other question. Do you want the other 2% to also be shifted to 4%?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry, I missed that.
No, it's no problem. I just want to make sure that I make that adjustment. Okay, so both of these should be 4%.
Yes.
Okay. And that'll make it easier. When we're presenting it to the board next week.
Yep.
All right.
Okay, and then there are, just for discussion purposes, and this will be for future meetings. So we hammered through most of the 600 policies. There are 3 that we are holding for future meetings. The first one is 609, investment of district funds. There was a number of recommendations brought forward by PSBA. However, there was also a recommendation to have it reviewed by our financial advisors and by our solicitors. So we are working through that review to ensure the language that PSBA is recommending fits with our district, and fits within our guidelines for our financial advisors. So this would be talking, the financial advisors would look at it from a lens of when we do bonds or refinancing. And they also assist with some of our investments. So we just want to make sure that this language is in alignment with what our district practices. So we will be bringing that at a future meeting. It's a very lengthy policy. So,
Well, and you can see here, everything in
and
bold
then
is new. So
yes,
it's significant. The changes are really significant.
yes.
Okay.
And then the other policy is 618, which is student activity funds. So there was some recommended language by PSBA that I want to review with our high school and middle school administrative team, because that's where our main student activity clubs are housed. So Ms. Jenko and myself will be reviewing this policy. I just want to make sure that practices that are happening are aligned with this policy and the recommendations. So that will be brought forward at a future meeting as well. And then the last policies that we have in the 600s are 626, and I believe there's a 626.1. These all talk about the federal guidelines. And there's attachments that need to be reviewed. So Ms. Jenko and myself want to review those attachments in further detail before we bring them forward to the board for adoption. As you know, there's with the federal funds that are happening right now to all the districts, the guidelines on policies and the way you can spend the money and the monitoring are tightening up. So we just want to make sure that everything that we put in our policy, that's the practice, and the attachments are updated. So those are the three policies that will be brought forward at a future meeting.
Are there any questions? So what we'll be doing in September is we'll be moving forward all but those three policies, or four policies, because the other one has a volume note. And we'll try to bring those forward at the next policy committee meeting, along with hopefully the beginnings of the 700s. We're waiting for PSBA to get us back the recommendations on the 700 level. But our goal remains that by the end of the calendar year, we'll be finished with the policy review. So we will, the hope is to be able to complete this, and then all we'll have moving forward in 2023 will be policies as PSBA provides updates. Right, put us in a much stronger stead, I think. The other thing I want to mention to you that I think we might have skipped was 216.1, the supplemental discipline records. This policy PSBA recommended that we delete. So we'll bring that forward to the board for deletion. They consider it redundant. If you go to the cross-reference and you look at the comments for 216, you can see here the policy is currently under legal review, and they'll provide us future updates. So they're suggesting that we not use this policy right now. So the thought was we'll delete it and then we'll adopt the new policy whenever they come forward. All right. Okay, back to the 600s. Are there any other questions from the cross-reference to any of the financial recommendations that were made? And do you feel comfortable speaking to the 4% next week? Or Ms. Green can be ready to do that?
Yes.
Okay, all right, great. So I'll go back to the general agenda. So we've worked through the 4 agenda items. I don't believe, Mr. Coughlin, you can confirm for me, I don't believe we have anybody here from the public.
That's correct, ma'am.
Okay, and we don't yet have a future meeting date scheduled because we're still waiting to hear from PSBA on the 700 level policies. So once we have that and we've had a chance to review them, then we'll schedule the next meeting. My hope is that it would be sometime in early to mid-October that we'd be able to get the next round done. And by then we should have these last few 600 level policies completed as well. from solicitor review. Okay. Is there anything else in policy that the board would like us to consider? And Ms. Green, do you feel okay with your summary, or do you need additional notes before Tuesday night? You're good? Okay. All right, well then that will conclude. We can adjourn the meeting. And thanks very much for your attention. We'll bring all these policies forward next Tuesday.
Thank you. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you very much. Have a great weekend as well, holiday weekend.
Bye.